So this is the eighth and final lesson in a series that I've been doing, reading through and studying the Gospel of Matthew. So we will be looking at the final three chapters of the Gospel, chapters 26, 27, and 28. So again, lesson 8 of the Gospel of Matthew, picking up in chapter 26. Now, just to backtrack for a moment, in chapters 24 and 25, we read through the Olivet Discourse, where the disciples have asked Jesus, after he had said that the temple, basically to paraphrase, was going to be destroyed. This obviously alarmed his disciples, and they asked him what were the signs that this is going to happen, and basically what are going to be the signs of the end of the age, because they're assuming that these are related incidents, that if God was going to allow the temple to be destroyed, that it must mean that the kingdom was going to be ushered in, and in essence that the end times were upon them. So Jesus gave a very long answer, kind of answering their questions in both the short term and the long term, because he obviously understood that they were two different events, separated by really a couple thousand years, and that there were things that they need to be prepared to face in their own lifetimes and to see occur. But there were things that in answering their questions relative to the end of the age and so forth, and the coming of the kingdom, there was going to be a large separation, and there were going to be signs of that happening that they were not going to see. And so we pick up in chapter 26, where it begins, when Jesus had finished all these words, again, as I was just kind of relating, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion." Again, he's been kind of forewarning them about this for some time now, letting them know what is going to happen when they come to Jerusalem. So again, they asked him these questions. He answered them about the destruction of the temple and the coming of the kingdom and all that. And now he's shifting the focus back. All right, let's focus in on what's about to happen while we're here in Jerusalem. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas. And they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. So Jesus, of course, has come to town. We looked at Palm Sunday. He arrives at the temple. He cleanses it of the money changers and so forth. He actually performs a miracle or so, maybe more. We don't know. And he's all teaching and preaching. He's confronting the religious leaders. He's really kind of verbally putting them in their place. Rhetorically, they try to challenge him with questions, and he answers them in a way that kind of shuts them down. He embarrasses them in front of the people. And so during Passover, the population of Jerusalem would swell to anywhere between 250,000 and 500,000 people, maybe more. There are varying estimates, but in any case, there are a lot of people there and a lot of people coming to the temple. And so the religious leaders, while they're plotting Jesus's demise, they're wary of just seizing him while he's there at the temple because of these crowds. And many of them obviously were followers of Jesus. And of course, they're afraid they're going to start an event. They're going to start a riot. And if that were to happen, the Romans would clamp down and so forth. So for a variety of different reasons, they are looking for a way to grab him quietly, or in a way that's not going to cause a stir amongst the people, at least not in broad daylight, so to speak. Now, having a private meeting like this, going to the court of the high priest and plotting kind of behind the scenes, to basically seize somebody for execution would most certainly have violated Jewish law. And what this fear of a riot, while it may have been reasonable, it certainly doesn't excuse what they're doing, kind of in the quiet of night behind closed doors, trying to plot the seizing and ultimate execution of anybody in this culture, in this time, legally. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany, now Bethany was a neighboring town to Jerusalem, I believe just a couple of miles away, at the home of Simon the leper. And of course, you assume this is Simon, who used to be a leper, otherwise they wouldn't all be in his home. A woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. Now, this perfume is purported to be very expensive, probably would have cost somewhere in the neighborhood of a year's wage at the time. In today's economy, if you figure that the median income is, let's just say it's $50,000, that obviously is very expensive perfume. And would certainly only be something that maybe a woman would use at her wedding or some extraordinary occasion. And of course, let's read on what she's going to do. And she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. Now, back then, when you're at a table, we, of course, sit at a dinner table. And at that point in time, in a lot of cases, they would actually be kind of semi-reclined, kind of leaning on an elbow with their legs stretched out. It was very, very common. But the disciples were indignant when they saw this and said, "Why this waste?" Now, we read in one of the other Gospels that the disciple who was leading the charge of, why is she wasting this, is Judas. Because Judas was the one who held the money bag. He was kind of the treasurer of the group. Why this waste? For this perfume might have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor. Again, we read elsewhere that Judas, the reason he's objecting to this is not just because he's the treasurer and he wants to be generous by giving the money to the poor. He was skimming. And so this was not some philanthropic thing that he wanted to do with the money. But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you bother the woman? For she has done a good deed to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." Again, he's going back to the theme and focusing them on, look, this is what's about to happen. "Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her." And certainly here we are, 2,000 years after this occurred, and we are talking about this woman's act of generosity of pouring this extraordinarily expensive perfume over Jesus just before, in essence, he is killed and buried. But then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests. And again, we read elsewhere about him exiting the dinner and so forth and going to the chief priests. We get some, in other words, more details in some of the other Gospels. So Judas went to the high priest and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" Obviously, him, capital H, meaning Jesus. And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him. 30 pieces of silver at that time was the price that you paid essentially for a slave. So this was, obviously this was quite a discount to get the Messiah. From then on, he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Again, the reason they're in Jerusalem And the reason there are crowds in Jerusalem is because of the Passover. And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is near. I am to keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And of course, this is what we come to understand as the upper room in this man's house. The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. Obviously, they're going to have lamb. They're going to have, if this is a Seder dinner, if you're familiar at all with Jewish tradition that they still conduct today, there are a variety of different elements that have to be there. So they had to kind of prepare for this meal. They can't just kind of show up and have something simple or do takeout. So there is preparation that needs to be done. Now, when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12 disciples. As they were eating, he said, truly I say to you that one of you will betray me. Deeply grieved, they each one began to say to him, surely not I, Lord. And he answered, he who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And Judas, who was betraying him, as we read before, said, surely it is not I, Rabbi. And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. So again, the Passover would be after sundown, which is when the Sabbath for the Passover would begin. And so this would be somewhere, in the early evening, you would assume. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and by the way, at this point, Judas has left, and we read a little bit more details in other Gospels that, Jesus tells him, go quickly and do what it is you're going to do. And obviously, Jesus is not taken by surprise at this betrayal. While they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And again, this is what we understand to be communion or the Mass or whatever the Eucharist. There are a variety of different descriptions of it in different traditions. But this is the institution. This is the original institution of it. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. In the Seder, there are multiple different times when you drink from the cup of wine, symbolizing different things. This last cup at the end of the meal is the cup of salvation. And so this is the one that Jesus is using to, again, create the institution of the Eucharist, of the communion, whatever. And so it's the cup of salvation that he is saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood, which of course brings salvation. My blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And so this, of course, is what we know as the Last Supper. And after they're finished with this, they leave and go over to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, again, this is some time has passed, and now they're over on the Mount of Olives. You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered. Again, that's an Old Testament prophecy there. But after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. And again, this is all taking place in the area of Jerusalem, in the province, if you will, of Judea, which is in the south. And Galilee, of course, is the province in the north. And that's where much, if not most, of Jesus's ministry took place, was in Galilee. And the disciples, the apostles at least, were pretty much all from Galilee. But Peter said to him, even though all may fall away because of you, I will never fall away. Jesus said to him, truly I say to you that this very night, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. All the disciples said the same thing too. An interesting, just a little sidebar here. There are writings, indicators that in years after this, that when Peter, would be in a crowd, particularly of a hostile crowd, they would crow at him because obviously, as we're going to see, and as you likely know, he is going to deny Christ, and a rooster is going to crow. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, we know it as, and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, that would be James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. There was tremendous strain on Jesus as he is preparing himself spiritually and emotionally for what is about to transpire. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And again, this is late at night. They've had the Passover meal, the Last Supper. They've gone back out. This is probably 11 or midnight or something like that. It's late. That's the bottom line. And so they're tired and they couldn't stay awake. He found them sleeping and said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, my Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Now, again, we read in other Gospels that the strain was such that he was actually sweating blood. And this is not hyperbole. There is a medical condition where if you're under enough strain that the small capillaries can burst and you can actually sweat blood. I mean, not gushing blood, but you would see red. You would see blood coming out in the sweat. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. While he was still speaking, so while he's saying those words, Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs, who came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one, seize him. Immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. So presumably the chief priests, the religious leaders basically have brought the temple guard. Now the temple guard really only had jurisdiction on the grounds of the temple. So they really didn't have authority to go off the grounds and execute an arrest or a seizure like this. But this is one of many things that were done by the religious leaders and so forth that was illegal. They should not have done. based on their own system of justice. Immediately, Judas went to Jesus and said, "Hail, Rabbi." Rabbi means teacher, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, and by the way, now I haven't gone back and checked this, but I don't think there are any instances where Judas calls Jesus Lord. And this, of course, is a perfect example. He calls him Rabbi, which is teacher. Whereas obviously before, we saw specifically when Jesus asked the group, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the Son of God." And you see them address him as Lord. Even before that, they address him as Lord, which means master, basically. And here, obviously, Judas, in betraying him, simply calls him Rabbi, which is teacher, someone with much less esteem and authority. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you have come for." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And of course, the rest of the disciples are going to flee in a second. But before that, and behold, one of those who were with Jesus, and we understand from another gospel, this is Peter, reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And we learn in Luke that Jesus actually takes his ear and puts it back on. So an act of healing, even as they're arresting him. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back in," this is Peter, "put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father? And he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels." Now, a legion in the Roman vernacular of an army was 6,000 soldiers. So, Jesus is saying, don't you know that I could have, 12 times 6,000, I could have 70 some thousand angels. And we know one angel in the Old Testament slew over 150,000 people. So if he summoned, even one legion of angels, even one angel, he obviously could have taken care of this troop of the temple guard that came to arrest him. At that time, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me, as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me." So again, as I was saying before, he was in the courts of the temple every day, teaching the crowds, performed miracles there, interacting with the chief priests, or the priests of the temple, the Pharisees, the scribes, all those teachers and so forth. And they didn't lay a hand on him. Of course, we read earlier why that was. They were afraid. They were afraid of the people, rising up if they tried to seize him. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets. Then all the disciples left him and fled. So they all scrammed. We're going to learn later here, and in other gospels, that Peter and John kind of follow at a distance as Jesus is taken to be tried. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. Now, Caiaphas was the high priest that was appointed by Rome. At this point, they exercise their authority to say, this is the person that's going to be the high priest, not this person. And so the reality is that there were a lot of folks that recognized Annas, who was Caiaphas's father-in-law, as the high priest, the real high priest, because he was, although he was not appointed by Rome, and he had been high priest, and he was replaced by the Romans for some reason that, you know, the religious folks did not appreciate so much. So they showed Annas a lot of deference. So we read actually in another gospel that they actually took Jesus to Annas first, and then they take him to Caiaphas. So they led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. And again, this is in the wee hours of the morning. This is not a time when the council would be meeting. This is not a time, you know, the Sanhedrin, the ruling body, was 70 religious leaders who would hear a case like this. And it was illegal to do that at night. They had to be given notice so that they could congregate. And now they accepted the presence of 23 of them as a quorum. But again, and we don't know how many were present. But we do know at least a number of the scribes and elders and members of the Sanhedrin have been notified to come for this. And the fact that they were at the they actually went to Caiaphas's residence, which is again not where you would do that. I mean, that would be illegal. They would have to bring him to the chamber where the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, meets. Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. So he's in the courtyard of the house of the high priest where this is taking place. And he entered in and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. Now, bearing false witness in a trial or a hearing like this was punishable by death. Now, certainly we have no indication, even though it's very clear that there were false witnesses, that any of them were punished. But later on, 2 came forward and said, "This man stated, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." Now we understand what Jesus was saying. He was referring obviously to himself as being the temple of God, his body. And that basically, if you kill me, if you execute me, I will come back. I will rise again in 3 days. So this was kind of foreshadowing of his resurrection, not a threat to tear down the temple. The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. Now, it was just as in our courts, you can't force an accused, you can't force an accused to testify. You can't force them to self-incriminate, certainly. And this was true then as well. And Jesus was not responding. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God." Now he's placing him under a sacred oath, under the divine authority of God himself, which again, let's read on for a second. "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." So he's basically forcing him to respond, and he's forcing him to give testimony that in the eyes of these folks is going to be self-incriminating. That was illegal. But Jesus has to answer because now he's been placed under a divine oath. And here's what he says. Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter, from this point forward, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." So he's basically saying from this point forward, Basically, I am going to be sitting at the right hand of God the Father, of the God that you worship. So in essence, going forward, you're judging me here, but I will be your judge. And then, of course, he adds, and coming on the clouds of heaven. And this, I'll show you a slide in a second. This is a reference to Daniel the prophet in speaking of the, who the Son of Man is, this Son of Man figure. Then the high priest tore his robes. Now, you're not supposed to, the high priest was not supposed to tear his robes unless it was an act really of mourning or repentance. It wasn't obviously to render a verdict of blasphemy. And he said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves death. Now, again, in a capital case like this, when it came time, when the witnesses had been heard, it was time to vote on what, the verdict of the jury, which is these 70 people. And again, presumably not all 70 were there. The way they tallied the vote, the way they voted, so to speak, would have been they would query the youngest first on the council. The youngest first would give their verdict, youngest to oldest, and then the high priest. In this case, the high priest basically giving his opinion first was completely contrary to the way that it was supposed to be. Then they spat in his face and beat him. And of course, this was illegal. They weren't to do that. And others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you? We learn in another gospel that they actually either blindfolded him or put something over his head so he couldn't see, who was hitting him. And of course, they're saying, okay, if you're a divine figure, you should be able to tell us who's hitting you. And they were hitting him, which of course is completely contrary to Jewish law at this point in time. So here is on the right, this is the passage from Daniel chapter 7. I kept looking in night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days is Yahweh God, it's God, and was presented before him, capital H. And to him, to this Son of Man, was given dominion, authority. Okay, so again, Jesus is saying, okay, you folks are judging me now. Understand that hereafter I am going to be your judge. Given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language, the whole world, might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting, an eternal dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And so Jesus, in quoting this, is saying, I am this figure. The phrase "from now on" is especially offensive, of course, because, as I said, he's saying, I'm going to be your judge going forward. Okay, let's move on. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, you too were with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are talking about. When he had gone out to the gateway, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives you away. So there was apparently an accent that the folks from Galilee, from the north, that people in Judea would recognize, and they would be able to place them as a Galilean. And so his accent is giving Peter away. And of course, 3 times, he denies knowing Jesus. Then he began to curse and swear, I do not know the man. And again, immediately a rooster crowed. Incidentally, they're inside the walls of Jerusalem. A rooster was considered an unclean animal. You could not have unclean animals, within the city walls, could not keep them. And so the fact that here a rooster snuck in and had an appointment with prophecy. The Holy Spirit yanked his tail so that he would crow at just the right time. And Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. And again, in years after, when Peter was in a hostile crowd, they would crow at him. Chapter 27. Now, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus. So again, we're now the next day. So this is probably around 6 a.m. They conferred against Jesus to put him to death, and they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Now, at this point in time, the Jewish authorities were not permitted to exercise capital punishment and execution. So they had to go to Pilate to get him to condemn Jesus. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed, and he went away and hanged himself. This repentance of Judas, there's much discussion and thought about. Okay, was this a genuine repentance? Was Judas possibly forgiven, by Jesus, by God? I don't know, is the bottom line. As far as him committing suicide, it says he hanged himself. Hanging it's not like we understand hanging, taking a rope and, tying a noose into it and, putting it on your neck, putting the other end over a tree or something, or tying it to a tree limb and standing on a stool and jumping off or whatever. Hanging by a rope is not something that they would have been necessarily familiar with. Hanging for them would have been impaling. And so getting, a large enough stick with a pointy end and kind of falling yourself, in essence, with it kind of tucked under your rib cage, so it would go into your heart, and just, falling into it. And that's what they typically would call hanging themselves, which of course we learn again in another gospel, that his entrails came out. So that would make a lot more sense, as opposed to hanging by a rope. The chief priest took the pieces of silver and said, it is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood. And they conferred together. Now, it's interesting how their morals kick in all of a sudden. And they conferred together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. And this was true, that there was a field called the potter's field. And if somebody was a stranger to the town, didn't have family with them, or for whatever reason, they died there and needed to be buried, and there was no one there to do it, there was this field where they would bury them. So they would have a place to bury them, and it was called the potter's field. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Again, understand that what he's describing here occurred in probably 32 AD, and he's writing this in probably somewhere around 62 AD. So let's say 30 years later. So he's describing an event of them, buying money bought, buying the potter's field, and it being called the field of blood 30 years later. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Now Jesus stood before the governor. This was Pontius Pilate, obviously, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And again, the religious leaders are trying to look for a secular charge that Pilate will accept as something worthy of execution. So that's why they're saying he was calling himself the king of the Jews, thinking, okay, a Roman procurator is not going to be happy with somebody calling themselves a king, because there is no king to them but Caesar. Basically he's rebelling. And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. So he didn't answer them. He answered Pilate that one question, at least for now. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. He wasn't putting up a defense. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed, and it wasn't just Pilate who was accustomed. This was a custom that had been carried out. The governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner who was apparently a murderer, a zealot, a rebel, basically, a revolutionary called Barabbas. Interestingly enough, in the language, bar would mean son of, and Abba is father. So son of the father was what Barabbas means. Now there's some tradition that his first name was actually Jesus, Joshua, Yeshua, the same, of course, as Jesus of Nazareth. So if that's the case, and I can't say that for a fact, but if that were the case, he's going to ask the crowd, do you want Jesus Barabbas, or do you want Jesus, the Son of God? So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ or Messiah?" For he knew that because of envy, they had handed him over. They, meaning the religious leaders. He knew that they had brought Jesus to him to be executed because they were envious of him for religious reasons. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, this is Pilate. He's sitting, of course, this is a hearing, so to speak. His wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. Again, the population of Jerusalem would have swollen because of the Passover, but this is, in the wee hours of the morning, right after sunlight. So not all the crowds would have gathered, and it certainly appears that the religious leaders had gathered the right crowd for them, obviously to render the right decision, to call out the right thing, let's say. "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands. So again, just to back up, so the loudest portion of the crowd was yelling, "Crucify him," but certainly not all of them. So there obviously was some possibility of a riot breaking out. He, meaning Pilate, took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. This idea, and again, this was not uncommon, of someone like this washing their hands, saying, I want no part of this. Of course, ironically, he didn't really wash his hands of it at all, because even to this day, in the Apostles' Creed, we recite, crucified under Pontius Pilate. Here we are 2,000 years later. And all the people said, his blood shall be on us and on our children. Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The scourging was, of course, a form of whipping. It was not like a single strand bullwhip that we might be familiar with. It was what we call a cat o' nine tails. So it would have a handle and multiple leather straps. And at the end of each strap, they would put a bone fragment, a stone, or a piece of metal, something like that, so that as they laid that whip across the person's back and or front, it would cause deep, deep bruising. It would gouge them and rip skin away, to the extent that oftentimes there would be internal organs exposed. Even and there were instances where prisoners actually died from the scourging. And this was a couple different things. It was obviously torture. It also, in some senses, was intended in some way to actually hasten death relative to the crucifixion, and certainly would put the prisoner into shock because of the loss of blood, and so forth. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, so they're getting him ready to take him out to be crucified, and gathered the whole Roman cohort. This was a troop, basically. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. So now they're going to mock him in a variety of different ways. The scarlet robe, of course, okay, you're a king, here's your robe. And of course, after having been scourged, having, that robe put on your back would hurt like crazy. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. Again, okay, a king needs a crown. Let's mock him in that way. Ironically, in Genesis, we read that when Adam and Eve fell, that, of course, God creates all these curses. And one of the curses was on the creation itself. And if you read amongst the curses that God spoke of, he spoke of the formation of thorns. So the thorns are part of the curse. And so when Jesus went to the cross, he was not only taking the curse of sin that befell mankind, he was taking to the cross the curse on the creation itself. So they were putting this crown of thorns on him to mock him, but the reality is, theologically, spiritually, it was representing that Jesus was going to be paying the penalty, and to revert, really, in an effort to eventually reverse the curse. So they put the crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand. Okay, here's your scepter, Mr. King. And they knelt down before him. They're bowing him and mocking to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him, which was, very degrading to be spit on, just as it would be today. And then they would take the reed from his hand and began to beat him on the head with it. After they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him, put his own garments back on, whatever robe or whatever he had, and led him away to be crucified. As they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross. And this, of course, the Romans had the authority to do that if in a case like this, or they're just out, out in the countryside somewhere, and they have a bag of whatever, they could go up to a townsperson and, tap them on the shoulder with their sword and say, here, you carry this. And that person was obligated to carry it. I believe it's up to 2 miles. It might have been 1 mile, but that they were obligated to carry it for a certain distance. And so in this case, Jesus would have been carrying the cross, and he wouldn't have been carrying the whole T. He would have been carrying just the horizontal, just the cross beam, basically. There would have been a pole there on the hill awaiting, the prisoner to come with the cross beam. And this is what, but of course, Jesus having been scourged, being in shock, it would have been difficult to carry this heavy wooden beam, however long that was. And I don't recall exactly how long the distance was, but it's understandable that it would have been difficult for him to carry that all the way to Golgotha. And so this man, Simon of Cyrene, and we see him later, by the way, in the book of Acts. But he's pressed into action to carry the crossbeam. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, and by the way, in Jerusalem today, there is a hill that has been identified that people believe is the hill that Jesus was crucified on. And truly, if you look at a picture of it, you can see where there are 2 indentations in the hillside that look like eye sockets, and you could say, okay, it sort of looks like a skull. Whether that is in fact the place, I'm not sure, but there is a site that they have identified as a likely place. They gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. Now this would have been it's a little bit of an anesthetic. And after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. So Jesus is not going to drink this wine and this gall. He's going to take the full force of the punishment. And when they had crucified him, meaning when they had nailed him to the cross, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. So they had put the scarlet robe on him. They took it off. They put his own garment on him. They lead him out to the place of crucifixion. Then they would strip the prisoner down. In the paintings that we see and so forth, he's wearing a loincloth. It's very likely, if not probable, that he was naked. And of course, as part of the spoils, the soldiers there who were guarding would be able to take the possession of whatever the prisoner came with. And so they're going to, instead of, it was like 1 garment, probably, maybe 2. And so they're not going to tear it. So they'll cast lots, which is like rolling dice to see who's going to get it. And this was to fulfill a prophecy, by the way, which Matthew doesn't cite in this particular instance, but there is a prophecy about that. And sitting down, the soldiers, that is, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head, they put up the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." And we understand that it was written in Aramaic or Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, the 3 primary languages of the folks who would have been there. At that time, 2 robbers, and of course we know this, the other thieves who were on either side of him, one on the right, one on the left. And of course, we know from the other Gospels that there was this dialogue that goes on amongst the 3 of them, with one of them seemingly coming to faith in Christ, and Jesus at one point promising that very day they would both be in paradise, meaning Jesus and this one thief. And those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." Now, the irony is he could have. He had the power to do it. But obviously, had he done that, we would still be resting on our sins. So they're hurling insults at him while he's paying the price of their sins. In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, and again, this is completely demeaning. This is not something that a religious leader should be doing. He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he delights in him. For he said, I am the Son of God. The robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words. They were at first, but then, of course, one, we understand, afterwards, sort of repents of this and ultimately expresses his faith in Jesus. Now, from the sixth hour, darkness fell. The sixth hour would have been at noon. So he was put on the cross probably somewhere in the area of 9 a.m. This is 3 hours later, and it says from the sixth hour, darkness fell upon all the land until the ninth hour, which would be 3 p.m. So from noon to 3 p.m., there's darkness. And the interesting thing is we do have certain secular references in other areas even of an odd darkness that fell over the land. Some tried to explain it away, saying it was an eclipse, but this was a new moon, and an eclipse would be impossible, astronomically impossible. About the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is taken from Psalm 22 that Jesus is reciting, which I would recommend you reading because it has quite an interesting description, written, 1,000 years before, a description of what appears to be crucifixion, even though crucifixion would not even have been invented as a form of execution for centuries after that. And some of those who were standing there, when they heard it, began saying, this man is calling for Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran, and taking a sponge, he filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink, Jesus, let him kind of moisten his lips, so to speak. But the rest of them said, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Obviously, some understanding that Elijah is going to appear at some point before the coming of the kingdom. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Again, we read in other gospels some of the other things that he said, especially at this time. He said, it is finished, basically, referring to the fact that the payment has been made, paid in full. And then, of course, he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And of course, as it says here, he yielded up his spirit. Behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now, the veil of the temple separated the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant would have been. It was the part of the temple that no one was allowed in except for a priest one day of the year, on the Day of Atonement, basically, was allowed to go in to sprinkle some blood on the Ark of the Covenant. Even then, they would tie a rope around this priest's ankle so that if he were to faint or to have a stroke or whatever, or a heart attack, they could pull him out so that a second person didn't have to go in. It was a holy, holy place. And of course, the belief was that this is where God resided in the temple, was in this Holy of Holies behind the curtain. And this curtain wasn't like a drape like we know, or even a theater curtain. It was very thick, woven, and huge. And it's of course described as being torn in two from top to bottom. So, someone from the top was the one who ripped at it so that it would tear from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. So in other words, it was not man who tore the curtain, it was God who tore the curtain. And of course, the reason for that is now that the penalty for sin has been paid for. Jesus has died. We all have access again to God, direct access to God. And the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. I am not even going to try to explain that. I have not really seen a really good explanation from anybody because we're not given any names and we're not giving any details in other than what I just read in those two verses. And it's not described in any of the other gospels either. So I'm not even going to try. Now, the centurion and those who were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, those who were with the centurion. So the centurion, again, is someone who would have authority over 100 soldiers. I'm sure there weren't 100 guards there, but he was there, and there was some form of a troop there. So the centurion and those that were with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake, they see all these things happening, they became very frightened. So they saw the darkness. They hear Jesus talking to God that, you know, as he expires, there's an earthquake. And of course, they weren't at the temple, but the temple, the curtain of the temple is torn. And of course, they become extraordinarily alarmed, very frightened, and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Many women were there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him. Among them was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Again, the sons of Zebedee were James and John. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was presumably a member of the Sanhedrin. It's very likely he was not present, you know, at the trial of Jesus. But anyway, this man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, which was not uncommon. That someone would go to the governor and say, you know, he's dead. Can I have the body to give them a proper burial, whatever? And so Pilate ordered it to be given to him, the body to be given to Joseph. And Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. Now, again, this is an indication. It says that Joseph was a rich man. This is an indication of it. You know, to have a tomb hewn, which means chiseled out of rock, you know, which was, you know, there were no jackhammers or dynamite. This would have been hand chiseled, a whole tomb that was dug out of the stone. This is a clear indication of obviously how wealthy Joseph was. And he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. So again, Jesus is put in this fresh tomb in rock, embedded in rock or carved out of rock with a big stone, probably a ton, put in front. Mary Magdalene was there and the other Mary sitting opposite the grave. So they knew where the grave was, by the way. So, you know, the one theory about the resurrection that they went to the wrong tomb or whatever is, well, there's a whole litany of reasons why that doesn't make any sense. But this clearly indicates they knew exactly where the tomb was. It would not have been uncommon, you know, for crucifixion victims to be thrown into a pit, you know, but if someone asked for the body to give them an honorable burial, it was not uncommon at all, you know, for the governor to grant that. And particularly in this case, remember that Pontius Pilate, having kind of washed his hands of it, he didn't want to execute him in the first place. So it would not be surprising that he would grant the request that someone came asking for the body. And of course, burying, particularly with Passover coming, they would have wanted to do so quickly. So obviously, Jesus dying, this would have happened very, very quickly, that Joseph would have gone to Pontius Pilate and asked, to take the body and bury it properly. Now, on the next day, the day after the preparation, this would be Saturday, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir," or actually this probably would have been Friday, because the preparation would have been the Passover Seder. Anyway, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days, I am to rise again. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first.' Pilate said to him, 'You have a guard, so make it as secure as you know how.' And they went and made the grave secure. Along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone." So they're allowed to take soldiers, station them in front of the grave. They put a seal on it, which had been like a banner or some kind of wax with wax or whatever attached to it, which would indicate if anybody tampers with this grave, the penalty for doing that is death. So they're allowed to take a guard with them, station them in front, and guard the tomb to keep anybody from tampering with the grave. Chapter 28. Now, after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn, now the Sabbath again for them is Saturday. So this is the dawn on Sunday. After the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the 1st day of the week, which of course is Sunday, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. Now, the stone was rolled away, by the angel, not to let Jesus out, but to let us see in. Jesus, as we see in his resurrection appearances, is able to go through walls, appear and disappear. His being is basically a whole other dimension of being. And so, while we read later that they could actually put their finger in the wound, so he had a body, but it was just a completely different dimension of a body. And so he didn't need the stone to be rolled away to get out of the tomb once he was resurrected. So the angel moved the stone away so that as these women come by and later others, they will see that Jesus is not there. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. The guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. Now, the guards were not there when the women arrived. So you might say, well, how do they know? How do we get this description of what the men experienced? Well, again, Matthew, because of his former position as a tax collector, had connections with the Romans. And so he would have had sources that could have informed him about this, exactly what they experienced. The guards shook for fear of him, became like dead men. They were literally shocked in almost catatonic state. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not here, for he has risen just as he said. Come, see the place where he was laying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, up north. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you. So, again, these two women, are the first to arrive and to experience the empty tomb. At that time, the testimony of a woman would not have been accepted, for example, in the hearing in the trial. The testimony of a woman was basically discounted. So the point is that if you were inventing a story about an empty tomb, you would not describe your first witnesses to be women, because the testimony of women was not accepted in the culture. You would have, if you were inventing the story, you would have said that Peter and John were the first to go to the tomb and found it empty, or any two of the apostles you would describe as having been the first. You would not describe the two women as is described by the Gospel of Matthew. The only reason you would recount that these women were the first ones to see and experience the empty tomb is if it was true. And they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, a very interesting mix, and ran to report it to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. And of course, we read about the resurrection appearances. More detail in other places, in other Gospels. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me." Now, while they were on their way, some of the guard came into the city. This is the guard that was guarding the temple. They've now gone into the city. And reported to the chief priests all that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to these soldiers and said, this is what you're to say. Here's the explanation you're to give. You are to say, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. Now, of course, the interesting thing about this is, number one, if they were asleep, how do they know it was the disciples? And number two, the penalty for falling asleep while on guard was death. And so you did anything you could to make sure you stayed awake. As a matter of fact, there are accounts of, if there was a guard of 4 guys guarding whatever, and one of them fell asleep, they would light the hem of his, his garment on fire, to wake him up. Because again, if any one of them fell asleep, they could put to death not only the one who fell asleep, but the entire guard. So they made sure they stayed awake. So again, they paid them off to come up with this story as an explanation. And if this should come to the governor's ears, to Pilate's ears, we'll win him over and keep you out of trouble. And they took the money. That's these guards. They took the money and did as they had been instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. So again, this is 30 years later after the facts. And to this day, 2,000 years later, that's still a theory that many hold to when trying to explain away, this empty tomb on Sunday morning. But the 11 disciples, of course, 11 because Judas is gone now, proceeded to Galilee up north, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some were doubtful. Of course, we read in other accounts about the issue Thomas had and so forth. And Matthew doesn't give us all the details. We get that in another gospel. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth." So again, what he was referring to in that Daniel passage has now taken place. Jesus is now going to be seated at the right hand of God, basically given power and dominion over all creation. Go therefore and make disciples. Interesting, it says disciples. A disciple is a learner. We're not being called to just go make converts and then just let them flounder in their infancy in the faith. We are to make disciples. We're, to, yes, bring them in. It's not, for example, it's not just about building your membership at the church. It's to make disciples of people who come to the church. Make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded. So again, discipling. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So again, this idea, this notion that of course, this is before Pentecost, but then, 50 days later, the Holy Spirit's going to come, and the Spirit of the living God, the Holy Spirit, is indeed with us always, at all times, everywhere. So that is the Gospel of Matthew, and just a very quick summary. Matthew, whose given name was Levi, almost certainly because he was of the tribe of Levi, of the Levites, who served in the temple. So he would have been raised with a very good Jewish education. He never self-identifies himself as the author of this gospel, but we have many, many sources that do identify him as the source of this gospel. And some of the earliest church writers and earliest church fathers attest to the fact that not only was he the author, but that Matthew was the first of the Gospels written, even though there are some who say it was Mark, because Mark is shorter, and there are a lot of things in Mark that are included in Matthew. But of course, that stands to reason, since they're both describing, Mark is in essence the remembrances of Peter, and Matthew is the remembrances of Matthew. And so they were living the same experience. So while you would likely see some certain things that would be different, just like any two witnesses of anything, their accounts are going to differ in some aspects, but there should be a lot of similarities as well. Matthew does seem to be clearly aimed at primarily a Jewish audience, because he quotes Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament, much more than any of the other Gospels. I haven't counted it, but perhaps even more than all of them combined. I'm not sure about that, but certainly much more than any of them. He is very careful in citing Old Testament scripture. He often is quoting prophecy and pointing out how Jesus fulfilled those Old Testament prophecies. And of course, in so doing, he is attesting to the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. He's the king that was promised to David, that would always be on his throne forever, an everlasting kingship, so to speak. So Matthew describes for us many of the details of the ministry and the miracles that Jesus performed, that Matthew himself witnessed and even participated in. And of course, he provides us details of the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection, which of course we were looking at with this particular lesson. And then of course, then he gives us what we understand as the Great Commission, the final instructions to his apostles, his disciples, and to us going forward. So that is the Gospel of Matthew. I hope that you've had a chance to view all of the 8 lessons and all 28 chapters, and that I hope that this has been meaningful and edifying for you. And I thank you for taking the time to go through the Gospel of Matthew with me. So God bless you.